so much. Okay, let me add, my name's Dave Goldenshoe. I'm a lawyer from Rome, Georgia, and I am involved with the Convention of States project. Jackie Peterson over here from Cedartown, sitting next to Trey, is our state director, and we've got Mike and Gail and John and some others that are here as well that are our county directors. The Convention of States project is like Barry, I know you're familiar with the Balanced Budget Amendment resolution that the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force and Scott Rogers are promoting and has been passed in the Georgia Senate. It is a group, we are a nationwide group, and we are out trying to get our state legislatures to pass a resolution in both houses calling upon Congress pursuant to Article 5 of the Constitution to call a convention of states, that's what it's referred to, for the purpose that convention would propose amendments to the Constitution. You've heard about the Balanced Budget Amendment. There's a group out there called the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force, which has already passed in 20 states, gotten 20 state legislatures to pass a resolution calling upon an Article 5 convention to be called. Its exclusive purpose would be to propose a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. The Convention of States project goes a little bit further than that, because a balanced budget amendment by itself is not going to get us where we need to go. Balanced budget amendment is good, but then, as Barry has so well pointed out, when you get in Washington, what are they going to do with it? Well, there's only two ways they're going to balance the budget, because we already know they're not going to tackle entitlements, or we're pretty sure they're not, and that is either continue printing a whole lot of money like they're doing, which is not good for us in the long run, and then the more likely unintended consequence would be a massive tax hike. So there has to be more to be done to rein in Congress than just a balanced budget amendment. So the Convention of States project goes a little bit further than that. We're asking the Georgia legislature, and we're organized, we've only been in existence 4 months. We're already organized in over 40 states in the country. And we are asking all of those state legislatures to pass resolutions that would do three things. That's the way we number it. One is to impose fiscal restraint upon the federal government. And impose fiscal restraint means something like a balanced budget amendment, but it doesn't just go there. It would include tax reform and other steps we could take to not allow Congress to, oh, well, we'll just raise your taxes. Well, no, you won't, Congress. You'll actually have to get into things. For example, every 10 years, perhaps our federal government needs to do what's called zero-based budgeting. And every single agency in government needs to justify its existence. And if it can't, it's gone. And these are some of the things that could be done with the Convention of States project resolution that could bring fiscal restraint and order to our federal government. The second thing that it's there for is to, the resolution goes, is to limit the scope or the jurisdiction and power of the federal government. That's kind of a big thing, but in reality, it follows exactly up on what Barry said. Congress will never pass an amendment that restricts its own power. This would allow a convention of states, which is delegates from all the states getting together, to look at some amendments along the lines that Mark Levin has proposed that could, in fact, rein in the federal government. What are some of those things? Well, I mean, we're sick of unfunded mandates. It's time to get rid of it. It's time for the federal government to pass laws that apply to Congress and the executive in the same way that they apply to us. It's time for single-issue legislation, like virtually every state has to have, so that we don't have any of these ridiculous earmarks that are out there and exist. Barry mentioned the repeal of the 17th Amendment. I personally am not in favor of that, but for a different reason. I think the popular election of senators exist and are there for the purpose of representing the state governments, the state legislatures in our federal government. So why don't we let the state legislatures decide how their senators in that state will be chosen? If some states want to elect them, that's fine. If other states want to appoint them, that's fine. But let's give that power back to the states. It doesn't have to be uniform. There's nothing magic in that. So there may be other ways to modify some of these things. And then finally, the third thing, which has got a popularity rating of well over 60% in the country, according to polls, is term limits on federal officials. That would include Congress, but potentially could include future Supreme Court justice appointees. When our Supreme Court, when we originally set up our government, if you were appointed to the Supreme Court, you might serve on it 10 years as part of your, or 12 or 15 tops as part of your lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. But now they're living, people live much longer, and so these appointed much younger, and therefore that has now become a very significant issue. So that's what the Convention of States resolution is we want to call an Article 5 convention. Now, I meant to ask this a lot earlier, but how many of you know or think you know what an Article 5 convention is? You've heard of it? Some of you, okay, so there's some of you that haven't heard of it. I didn't see your hands. The big thing, a lot of things that happen when we talk about Article 5 conventions is people say, oh, no. We don't want a constitutional convention because, as Gail mentioned earlier, people think that these people are going to come together from the states and they're going to get together and somehow go crazy and rewrite our Constitution, and just we'll have awful things come out of it. It's almost the first thing out of every legislator's statement that they'll be making to us about a concern when we ask them to move forward with the Article 5. Let me tell you why a runaway convention is an impossibility under Article 5. It's not a chance of it, it is an impossibility. And it starts with this. First of all, again, it's not a constitutional convention. The convention is being called for a very limited purpose, as is set forth in the resolution that the state legislatures pass. So it's not, and it's not, that resolution does not say to rewrite the Constitution. The states have total control over this convention. I can tell you a little story about our founders and how these things came about. It's a neat little story that I kind of cut out tonight because I want to keep the time down. But the states control it. The states decide who the delegates are that are going to go to this convention. The legislatures or the governors or speakers or whatever appoint these people. Most of these people that go are going to actually be state legislators in all likelihood. So if they go to this convention and they start trying to decide to rewrite the Constitution, well, there's a couple of things going to happen. First, the states have the right to recall them if they get off task. Secondly, the people that they send, or really firstly, the people they send are going to be people that are going to stay on task, but if they get off task, they can be recalled. Thirdly, they can be required to take oaths, and there can be penalties for their violating their oaths. So the likelihood that at one of these conventions, you're going to have 50 states there, and it takes 26 states to do something. The likelihood that 26 state legislatures are going to send delegations that are suddenly going to go rogue and try to impose their will upon the rest of the convention is simply not going to happen. It's not a political realistic possibility, and there is no history in the many conventions that have been held intrastate as well as interstate in the history of this country. It's never happened before, and it's not going to happen here. So that's just the first hurdle, the likelihood. The second thing is, if you did get 26 state delegations that went rogue, when that happens, all they do is propose amendments. They can't propose and ratify them. They propose amendments that then have to be referred out to the states, and 3/4 of the states' legislatures have to adopt them. Well, Congress is responsible for deciding whether the state legislatures ratify the proposed amendment or they can call for state conventions to do it, which is the way our original Constitution and the 21st Amendment were adopted. So if there were a rogue amendment that came up before Congress, they have no constitutional duty to send a rogue amendment back out to the states. If it's an amendment within the scope of the convention, they have an absolute ministerial duty to do it. But Congress can get in the way of it, is the point. Then if Congress doesn't get in the way of it, it's universally accepted that lawsuits will be filed, one after another, to stop the rogue amendments. And I personally have had the tremendous opportunity to talk to virtually all of the constitutional scholars in the country who've written on this subject in the last 15 years. I personally talked to them. And we've debated this issue, and it is our considered view, mine being the lowest of all of them, that a court will in fact throw out, if faced with the issue, a court is going to find a rogue amendment to be just that and not allow it to go to the states. But let's say it gets past that. So we have 26 rogue delegations that pass the amendment. Congress refers it out. No court stops it. Let's look at the breakdown. It still has to be adopted by 3/4 of the states, okay, to become an amendment, just like all of our amendments have had to go through that. Well, let's look at a breakdown of the states. There are 26 state legislatures that have both houses are Republican controlled. There's 18 state legislatures that both houses are Democratic controlled, and there's 6 legislatures that are split. And that can change 2 or 3 or 4 every now and then, but it's not going to be a massive change over time in that balance. So if the liberals came along and were able to do all these horrible things we've talked about and get away with it and rewrite our Constitution and it's submitted out to the states to be ratified, to get ratified it would take all 18 of the Democratic states to adopt it. Then you go to your 6 split states. That means 6 houses, either Senate or House in those states that are currently Republican controlled, those houses would have to pass it. Then they'd have to get 14 more states with dual Republican control in their houses to pass it. So it would have to go through whatever the 34 different Republican-controlled bodies would have to pass this rewrite of the Constitution in order for it to become law. So, Phyllis Schlafly is a great woman, and her Eagle Forum is a great entity. She's done wonderful things for this country, but she is one of the biggest proponents of the runaway convention and be afraid of it. We need to go in the opposite direction. Phyllis Schlafly has done wonderful things for our country, and so she's earned the right to be wrong once. Okay? And the same thing can be said for the John Birch Society. I mean, we're in the heart of the John Birch Society right here. And one of the most wonderful things that happened to me was just a couple of weeks ago when I gave a speech to the Rome Tea Party, and Rebecca Johnson. Boy, she has been a John Bircher forever. She knew me practically when I was in diapers. She came over to my house with her husband to recruit my parents to be John Birchers. And she came up to me after the talk I gave, and I asked her, I said, it's really important. I call her Becky. Not many people do. But I said, Becky, I said, I really would like to know how you feel about this. She said, David, I'm totally with you. She said, you're the first person that's ever explained to me it's not a constitutional convention. It's something different. And that's, in fact, the case. So, the chance for this runaway convention that we hear about is simply not going to happen. Let me finish by going back to 1787 and our wonderful founding fathers when they wrote this document. They did such a tremendous job. When they came together, you had large states and small states that were fighting with each other. You had slave states and free states that were fighting with each other. You had states that were agrarian versus states that were were maritime versus states that were industrial. And they were all fighting with each other. But they found a way to get together and come up with this wonderful document. But they didn't know what kind of federal government they were creating. They didn't know if they were creating one that was too strong or one that was going to be too weak. And they didn't know. So they put in it a provision for amending, which is the Article 5 provision. But the original, well, it went through multiple stages. But 2 days before they were getting ready, they'd been there for 4 months, from April, and it was now in September, May through September. 2 days before the convention was over, there was a fellow by the name of George Mason from Virginia. He was absolutely convinced that they were creating a monster federal government that was going to oppress the people, get rid of state sovereignty, and that it was going to happen in his lifetime. In fact, he felt so strongly about it that he ultimately did not sign the Constitution. But 2 days before the convention was about to adopt the final Constitution, he had already raised this issue before, but he stood up and he basically said, we've got to make one more change. And he says, we have not planned for it. What are we going to do if this federal government becomes so large, becomes so oppressive, becomes invading the privacy rights of our citizens, becomes a government that, that ignores the Constitution and passes laws that it has no right to pass, goes beyond its powers. Sound familiar? So what are we going to do? How do we fix it? Because Congress is never, exactly what Barry said tonight. He said Congress will never pass an amendment to fix this Constitution that draws back on its own power. And so that was when the founders, it was Gouverneur Morris and Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts proposed the amendment that now has become Article 5, which says that when 2/3 of the states submit applications, resolutions, as I've spoken about earlier, to Congress to call a convention, then the states can have this convention that we want to have, and they can propose the amendments that we know Congress wanted. George Mason must have known what was going to be happening in several hundred or 225 years later, because that's where we're at. And this mechanism that we have, Article 5, and this is what's so important, because our founders were so wonderful at putting together a document, imperfect as it was, that has worked well. The Article 5 Convention is not a mechanism to fix the problems that Barry has been talking to you about tonight that we all know about. It is not a mechanism to fix it. It is the mechanism that the Founding Fathers put in the Constitution for us to fix it. And so the time has come. And so I stand before you tonight basically with this. We would love, we have plenty of materials here for you, and we come to you to ask you to join with us, to sign up, to get your names on the conventionofstates.com website, and join with us, because in this legislative session that's coming up, we are going to be pushing mightily hard to get the House and the Senate to pass the Convention of States resolution. And we need you to be available to help us, to send emails at critical times to the critical legislators, maybe pick up the phone and make a phone call, or to write a letter. I think most of it will be done by email and by phone. But we need you to be there to help us do it. You heard Barry talk about what are the, it's going to be a long process. And there's not any one way we're going to solve it. But this is the way that our wonderful founders gave us to solve it. And if we don't do it, then who? So, I end with a final statement, and that is this. Georgia was the 4th state in the country to ratify the United States Constitution in 1788. It needs to be the first that adopts the Convention of States resolution that saves that Constitution. So, I'm available as well to answer questions. Thank you very much.
You know, I'm a big proponent of this, and I really do believe that this is our golden opportunity, and that I strongly encourage everyone to get Mark Levin's book and to read it thoroughly, because he researched this inside out. He said there had to be another way than what we were doing at the, previously, and he found the Article 5 section of the Constitution, and he said, my gosh, I've watched him on interviews and it's like a revelation that we don't have to ask the federal government's permission to hold these conventions, and that we just go ahead and we do it. Now, my question is, say we propose these different amendments and we get 3/4 of the states to ratify an amendment. What assurance do we have that our federal government, especially one that like we have now, is even going to follow that amendment and obey it?
Well, I think the assurance you have is the people themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, history tells us there have been 27 amendments passed, and while the government hasn't always followed them to the T, by and large, we've never seen Congress or the federal government just sit up and say, no, we're not going to go that. We've never seen the government nullify itself in some ways. So the answer is no. It will take the people to remain steadfast and elect good people like Barry to the House and have them there. I think what we're looking at here is, if this gets pulled off, and there's a Forbes article back there that says the biggest story of 2016 isn't going to be the campaign for the presidency. It's going to be the Convention of States. There's two groups that are pushing very hard and will likely get close to 34 by the end of 2015. The Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force and the Convention of States group. When that happens, and it's in the 32nd or 33rd or 34th legislature, if Georgia should already be in the ball game by then, so that's not going to be it, I don't think. But when it gets to 33, 34, 35, Ohio or Iowa or somewhere like that, there's going to be so much media descend upon those legislators trying to pull them this way or that way. It is going to become something. And then if we ever get to 34, which I believe we will, because unlike anything we've had in the past, we've come very close to a balanced budget amendment convention in the past. But it always died away because Congress found little cute ways to slow the movement down. The reason it's going to happen this time is because both groups that are pushing are very well funded, very well organized. And I think we're at a point in our nation's history that we've never been at before in terms of the need for this mechanism to be used. And so I don't see that stopping. But if a convention is ever called, my goodness, the media that is going to be there, because they're going to be out there and they're going to be CNN and all this. Who's going to be the George Washington or the James Madison of this convention? And you're going to have all this stuff going on. And it will be, I predict, the first one. We can have many of them, and we probably need many of them. We probably need to pass an amendment that says we have one every 10 years or every 15 years, just to keep a check on the government. But in any event, when it happens, I think you're going to see, I believe it will probably be the biggest political event in all of our lifetimes. I really believe it'll be that big. It's that significant.
David, I think, by the way, it would be that kind of significant event. But you know, as I've said recently, this is a historic moment. Here we are having the ability to live, to be part of the same thing those founders that we revere, that we get cold chills when we think of. We are part of the same thing that they brought to this nation. And that is, it's, yeah, fundraising and all that's great, but it's that cause, that principle, and we've got something going here. Why don't you share, Galen and I and all of us have had opportunities to discuss this over the last couple of years, and we have run into those, you know, who oppose the convention. But things seem to be shifting, and you and Jackie have experienced some significant changes. You mentioned Becky, but are there others? You know, what's the feeling of the legislatures and so forth?
Well, first of all, we've already met with a lot of the House members. The lay of the land in Georgia is this. The folks that I've talked to in leadership in the Senate, and Barry, you correct me if I'm wrong on this because you still have a lot of friends there, but my sense of it is, and they have assured me over and over, they think that once this resolution is submitted to the Senate, it will pass. They're largely behind this. They understand Article 5 and how it works. They don't have the worries that sometimes other legislators have, and they seem to think we'll pretty much be home free in the Senate. Now, that's not to underestimate that there's always hurdles and things, and we will be diligent. But I think we're going to be okay in the Senate. In the House, you know, you've got two groups of people in the Georgia House. You've got what I call the young bucks. You know, about Trey would be one of them. You know, 50, I think something like there's 120 Republicans in the House, and I think more than half have been elected in the last 5 years. I think that's the number. So you really have some, and let me tell you, you folks here in this room and other folks, you know, in the Tea Party group have a lot to do with those people being there. They're young, they're conservative, they're excited, and they're pretty much on board with us. Then you have that other half of the House, which tends to be in leadership, many of them, that is the more reserved. Some of them were former Democrats that have become Republicans. They're a little bit more seasoned and, you know, willing to kind of draw back a little bit and think through the situation. Now, fortunately, Chairman Meadows, who is the Rules Committee Chairman in the House, we met with him early on, and he is on board with us. Thanks a lot to Trey for getting us in there to see him. So that's a huge hurdle right there. If you got the chairman on your side, most people, I mean, one of the legislators I talked to tonight in the House told me, she said, if you've got Chairman Meadows on board, everybody else will get in line. So that's a good thing. We're scheduled to meet with the Speaker in January. So my sense of it is that we've got tremendous momentum, and I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll get it through. There are just so many things that can happen in a legislative session that just pop up and boom, whatever it is that the momentum you had going is stopped dead in the track. So we'll never let off our diligence until it's passed. But I would say at this point I feel good about it. The most important thing I want to do, we're interviewing two different folks to be the primary sponsor for the House bill, House resolution, and we want to get the right person for that to maintain the diligence that I'm talking about. So, in the state of Georgia, I feel very good about it. Over the country, it's truly, my sense of it is becoming overwhelming. You're going to hear more and more and more and more in the media about the Convention of States project and about Article 5 conventions. Again, to be 4 months old and already have organizations set up in 40 states at this point is tremendous. The Convention of States folks, leadership in that group are very, very, very sharp people, and like they've known who to ally themselves with. They've been very involved in the ALEC conferences, which both the one in August in Chicago, where all the state legislators from all over the country come. They were very involved there in announcing at a high profile that the Convention States project was kicking off. They were there in December. And to the extent this Mount Vernon Assembly that you may, do y'all know what the Mount Vernon Assembly is? I know Barry does. Some of you. What happened is this Article 5 convention momentum has led a group of legislators, state legislators from all over the country to organize into a group. They have a formal group they call the Article 5 Caucus. And with the support of the leadership from the Convention of States project, they're very tight and they talk to each other, which is what I'm talking about in terms of making key relationships they've done a good job with. But this Mount Vernon Assembly was December 7th, where the 98 legislators from all over the country, from 32 different states, came together on their own dollar, not as representatives of their states, but as people who were representatives in the states, to get together and talk. And then they are going to get together again, or some delegates are going to get together in May, and then again next December, to pull together what would ultimately be the rules for an Article 5 convention, if and when, I would like to say, it's held. The great thing that came out of that, which is kind of part of this momentum I'm talking about, is the feedback that we got back from them. Was the clear sense of it was not if we're going to have an Article 5 convention, but when we have this Article 5 convention. And the way that it's going, it's looking like 2016 may well be the year. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've got a question. We had this discussion in another group the other day, and you may have an answer to this because we kind of got in many discussion and we didn't get a clear answer. But it came down to the rules of a called convention. One constitutional scholar in the room brought up that constitutionally he believed that Congress, because Congress ultimately has to make the call for the convention, gets to establish the rules of the convention.
I've seen that argument.
Where I made the argument that in every delegation, the delegation sets its own rules upon assembly. Do you have any knowledge of where that would go?
Yeah, I've seen, it's a kind of convoluted federal argument for how Congress can reach out and seize control over the rules of this convention. The simple answer is that nobody knows because we've never done it. But what we can call upon, we can look back, there were 33 conventions of colonies/states that occurred prior to the 1787 convention. And we can look at those because when you talk about an Article 5 convention, most of our founders had been at one or more of these interstate conventions. So we can look there to see what did they have in mind when they started talking about an Article 5 convention, or when they put that in the Constitution. And as we look at that material, we see that in every situation, the convention itself had total control over its own rules. The states, in their call, can again, in their appointment of the delegates, have the authority to tell the delegates, limit it to this or that, or things of that nature. But the conventions themselves that were held, the convention was responsible for the rules, not the